this is Mrs. Cooper, and I'm here to introduce our next chapter, Chapter 17, The Civil War. This lesson is Lesson 1, The Two Sides of War. We'll take a look at both sides' goals, strategies, strengths, and weaknesses. So grab your notes, either hard copy or electronic, and let's get started. Before we get too far into the Civil War in our notes, you do need to be aware that the North and South had several terms for themselves. Throughout this chapter, you will see the North and the South being referred to simply as the Union versus the Confederacy, Yankees versus the Rebels, the Blue versus the Gray, the Federal troops, and Dixie. And it's important to know more for lesson 2 and as you get into it that these are words that are interchangeable. So be familiar with them. If you don't have any experience with the Civil War, I do encourage you to write these down somewhere as kind of a cheat sheet for you. I also wanted you to see what the two sides flags look like. The North looks like a typical American flag. It had 35 stars, and the South, their Confederate flag, was known as Dixie. As we saw in last chapter, in December 1860, South Carolina announced that it was seceding from the United States, citing that their states' rights had been and would continue to be violated by a federal government led by the Republican Party that wanted to stop the expansion of slavery. Within a few months, 6 other states had followed South Carolina out of the Union. After the Battle of Fort Sumter, President Abraham Lincoln called on Northern citizens to put down the rebellion, and 75,000 men enlisted or signed up for military duty in the Union Army. This action was not well received by some Southern states that had not yet seceded, but once they learned that their president was raising an army to attack his own citizens, 4 more states seceded, and a total of 11 Southern states joined together to form the Confederate States of America. For many states, choosing sides in the Civil War was easy. An invisible boundary formed between states that allowed slavery and ones that did not. This line was called the Mason-Dixon line, but for some it wasn't as cut and dry as it seems to decide which states would remain in the Union. 4 states, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, were called border states, or states where slavery exists, though it was generally not as widespread as in the states further south. Each of these states had close ties to both the North and the South, but all will ultimately remain in the Union. On the chart on page 1 of your notes, the states are listed in order of easiest to more difficult to remain in the Union. After losing 11 of the 35 existing states, Lincoln was aware that the border states were a vital strategy to the Union. Delaware was probably the easiest of the border states to persuade to stay in the Union. It was the northernmost of the border states, close to the key Union city of Philadelphia, had few slaves, and a majority of their citizens supported the Union. Mrs. Cooper's and Lincoln's home state of Kentucky was a very strategic move on Lincoln's part. In 1861, Lincoln wrote, quote, "To lose Kentucky is nearly the same as to lose the whole game. We would as well consent to separation at once, including the surrender of this capital." Well said, Lincoln. My thoughts exactly. Everyone knows the sun shines bright on my old Kentucky home. After Fort Sumter, Kentucky declared itself neutral, but Congress pressured the president to send in troops. Lincoln knew that if he took Kentucky by force, he'd have a hard time keeping the state under control. Like a rebellious teenager, he gave Kentucky its space and hoped by respecting its declaration of neutrality, Kentucky would come to support the Union on its own. As luck would have it, the Confederacy wasn't nearly as patient as Lincoln and invaded the state, trying to take control of government buildings. Kentuckians were upset by this Confederate invasion and chose to side with the Union. By keeping Kentucky on his side, Lincoln now controlled all of the Ohio River, a major waterway he could use to transport troops and supplies. He then set his sights upon the Mississippi River and the volatile states of Missouri. Missouri was trickier for Lincoln. Controlling Missouri would mean the Union could control parts of the Mississippi River and major routes to the west. But if you remember from last chapter, a majority of Missourians sided with the South and even played a large part in bleeding Kansas when border ruffians rigged the pro-slavery vote in Kansas. A stronger support for the Confederacy forced Lincoln to set up a Union-controlled government in Missouri for the length of the war. I imagine it was like trying to wrangle an alligator for Lincoln's Union government in Missouri. Maryland, perhaps. is the most important of the border states. It was closer to Richmond, the Confederate capital. Take a look at the map. Of all the places in the South, why do you think the Confederacy chose to make Richmond, Virginia its capital? I mean, President Davis was from Mississippi. Why not there? Or why not in the middle of the South, equidistant for all Confederate states to reach? No, there's a logical reason to Richmond. Ever heard the phrase, keep your friends close, but your enemies closer? Separating itself from Lincoln's headquarters by just a mere 100 miles lets the Confederacy be physically close to the decisions of the Union Army. Plus, Virginia is the most industrial, most populated, and wealthiest state in the Confederacy. It made sense to President Davis to make camp in Virginia. But for the Union, Virginia as a Confederate state and possibly losing Maryland was too close for comfort. Most significantly, Washington, D.C. lay within the state of Maryland. If Maryland seceded, the North capital city would be surrounded by Virginia and Maryland, two Confederate states, making it vulnerable to invasion. To encourage the local government to secede, Confederate supporters in Maryland destroyed railroad tracks and cut telegraph wires. Lincoln was forced to declare martial law, or a type of rule in which the military is in charge and citizens' rights are suspended. So Maryland joined the Union by force, and any disloyal government officials were jailed throughout the war. Up to the Civil War, Virginia was a larger territory than we know it as today. That's because a new state will be added to the Union during the Civil War. In 1861, citizens in the western counties were not happy with its state's decision to secede. The Appalachian Mountain Range runs through the western part of Virginia, making it difficult for widespread farming, so slavery was not as prevalent to the west as it was in other parts of Virginia. Those western counties of Virginia requested statehood, and Congress approved it in December of 1862 under the condition that the new state would abolish slavery. Thus, West Virginia was born as a border state and officially became a state in 1863, 2 years into the Civil War. As you can see, the Civil War was more than a war between the states. It turned brother against brother and neighbor against neighbor. Kentucky Senator John Crittenden had two sons who became generals during the war. One fought for the Confederacy and the other for the Union. Even President Lincoln's wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, had relatives in the Confederate Army. This is why the Civil War is often referred to as the Brothers' War, as many families were torn on their beliefs of slavery, secession, and states' rights. By the middle of the war, neither side could have predicted how deadly or devastating the toll war would take on our nation. In 1863, President Lincoln decreed a national holiday called Thanksgiving to be celebrated on the last Thursday of November. It would serve as a chance to take a break and give thanks and praise for one's blessings, and we've been celebrating it ever since. Gives a whole new meaning to your turkey comas, Black Friday shopping, football binge watching, and the Macy's parade, doesn't it? And I bet many of you can trace your lineage to relatives who fought in the Civil War. Being from Kentucky, a border state, I wondered if my ancestors were Yankees or rebels. While I have many who fought, I am privileged to have in my possession my great-great-uncle's Union Army belt buckle. Here's a picture of it. Lieutenant William Ashby fought with the 17th Kentucky Infantry at the battles of Fort Donelson, Shiloh, Chickamauga, and the Siege of Atlanta. You'll get to those battles next week. And in next lesson, you'll learn more about a soldier's life, including their uniforms. If you don't already know, ask your parents or grandparents if your family has any ties to the Civil War, and be sure to share it with your history teacher. This chart is on page 2 of your notes. We will cover the Union advantages first. But before we begin, take a look at the checkpoint questions at the bottom of your page. The question asks how each of these resources will help the Union: population, railroads, factories, and factory workers. As we go, feel free to stop the video as I address each of these to answer the question. The pie graph at the bottom of your page shows the stark difference in all of these resources. Clearly, the Confederacy will lack in many ways. So when the war began, the Union and Confederacy each had advantages and disadvantages, but how each side used its strengths and weaknesses would determine the war's outcome. The North had a larger population, and therefore will always have a larger pool of men to become soldiers. If there's any wide-known fact about the Civil War, it's that it was the deadliest of all American wars. Adding soldiers to the ranks will be a priority for both sides. The North's Industrial Revolution of the 1830s, 40s, and 50s had given way to a multitude of factories in northern cities. A large portion of the North's population worked in these factories. And these factory workers will make great soldiers because they are used to taking orders and focus on one task at a time. And those cotton mills will transform to manufacture wartime necessities like guns and ammunition. Women who worked in looms won't go to war, but will be a critical part of the war effort. Another Union advantage is their vast amounts of railroad tracks. This map shows the amounts of railroads in red and canals in blue during the 1800s. And while it looks like the South had just as much access to the rails as the North does, the South's tracks cover shorter distances and don't link together like the ones in the North do. As we discussed the border states of Kentucky and Missouri, those canals are only in the north and will link the Ohio and Mississippi rivers to more northern cities where factories produce goods and military regiments assemble. This access to railroads and canals will give the Union a major advantage to transporting troops and supplies where they need them, when they need them. Imagine arriving on the battlefield and you've had to walk miles and days to get there, but your opponent, he just rested on railway cars. You undoubtedly have spent more time and energy, which could affect your performance in battle. I know when you think of farmland, the North doesn't come to mind, but farms are needed everywhere. It's just the climate and soil conditions that determine what is grown in a certain region. And while the South focused its plantation on cash crops like cotton, northern farms grew every type of fruit and vegetable to support its large population. Therefore, the North will enjoy a greater food production. Much like we're seeing in our grocery stores today during this pandemic, the North may have had more food. The war will take its toll on rationing that food properly for civilians and soldiers alike. Wars always decimate economies, but nonetheless, the North will have more food than the South, although it certainly wasn't an all-you-can-eat buffet for 4 years. And probably the greatest advantage to the North was sound leadership in President Abraham Lincoln. Because of his assassination, we today look upon Lincoln with admiration. But you probably should know that although he won the election of 1860, it's not safe to say that every Northerner supported him. Lincoln will face much criticism as a wartime president. No one could argue that Lincoln was a strong public speaker, decisive and skillful in his actions, and of course, patient. We saw how his patience paid off in waiting for Kentucky to remain in the Union. You'll see Lincoln play this war like a calculated game of chess. He doesn't make a move without purpose. As talented of a leader as Lincoln will be, he will struggle early on to find strong, experienced military leaders. Unfortunately for him, generals like Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson are from southern states and choose to fight for their state, not the Union. Did you know that Lincoln actually asked Robert E. Lee to become the commander of his Union Army? Lee respectfully declined Lincoln's offer, citing his love for his home state of Virginia. He did not want to take up arms against his fellow Southern brothers, but once Fort Sumter happened and Virginia seceded, Lee felt an obligation to defend his home from attack ordered by his own president. Another disadvantage the North will face is the time and money it will take to transport soldiers and supplies to battle. Most of the fighting during the war will happen in the South, and while the North has thousands of miles of railroad track and control of major rivers, Lincoln will spend millions of dollars in today's equivalent to use these modes of transportation for the sake of war. Now let's take a look at the Confederacy. Probably one of the most obvious advantages for the Confederacy is their home field advantage. Being closer to home means less time and money spent to transport troops. The Confederate Army knows the land and has many allies still at home on their farms. But remember, not every Southerner supported the Confederacy, especially those border states. So, can I tell you a quick story my great-grandfather Isaac told me when I was a little girl? Who am I kidding? This is pre-recorded. You have no choice but to listen. He told me that his mother, Cara Dina, as a small child, witnessed Confederate soldiers arriving at their home in Kentucky, looking for food and lodging for the night. The soldiers threatened to burn their home and barns if my great-great-great-grandfather reported their whereabouts to local authorities. My family obliged, and when the rebels left that morning, as my grandfather put it, My great-great-great-grandfather hopped on his horse and rode a full day's trip to the county seat authorities to make a report of the Confederates' location. And do you know what the seat authorities did? The local authorities fined my great-great-grandfather $5, five whole dollars, for harboring the enemy. That was a lot of money back then. Nonetheless, the Confederates fighting on their home turf will give them momentum that the Union will have to combat. And speaking of momentum, probably the greatest of strength of the Confederacy is their passion for fighting. This will, or internal motivation, will keep the Confederate spirit up for a long, long time. You'll learn later on in this chapter how the Union in particular will struggle with opposition to the war as it drags on, but the goal of the Confederacy was to be an independent nation and to defend their way of life. They aren't trying to invade the North and change their ways. They simply want to preserve their lifestyle and believe that all they need to do is keep the faith, remain confident and courageous long enough that the North will grow tired of fighting and convince them that the war was not worth its cost. In fact, the Confederacy took pride in the name rebels. A New Orleans poet wrote that the Confederacy compared their cause of defending their nation to that of the Patriot Army during the Revolutionary War. And coincidentally, have you noticed that the strengths and weaknesses of both sides are similar to that of the British and Patriot armies during the Revolution? Spoiler alert, unfortunately for those rebels, the Civil War will not have a similar outcome to that of the rebels in the Revolution. And while Lincoln won't find a military bromance until the war is nearly over, the Confederacy is stacked with military experience. Experienced military leaders like Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, Jeb Stuart, P.G.T. Beauregard, and George Pickett, plus more, bless the Confederacy with a smorgasbord of military expertise that will deliver several Confederate victories early on in the war. And let's take a moment to respect those beards. Facial hair of the Civil War was pretty epic. Lastly, the South doesn't seem to be worried that it's outmanned or outgunned by the North. It's literally banking on its plantation cotton to sell to Europe to keep its pockets lined with war money. We'll see more of that on our next slide. And while the deficits of the Confederacy look like a short list, these weaknesses will take its toll, especially as the war drags on. A severe lack of resources, as seen in the pie charts at the bottom of your notes, show that the South will lack the logistical resources it takes to fight a war. For most of the war, the Confederacy will arrive on the battlefield with fewer men, fewer guns, fewer cannons, and fewer ammunition. Another weakness of the South is the dynamic of the Confederacy itself. While states were eager to secede from a federal government threatening their way of life, they weren't necessarily eager to join a new federal government either. The reasoning in seceding was to protect their states' rights. That means that they want to listen to their state governments, not a new Confederate government. As such, Confederate President Jefferson Davis will have a very hard time controlling rebellious, passionate states that don't want a federal government telling them what to do. For example, when state militias are formed, President Davis wanted to combine those state militias into a Confederate army. But many of those local regiments refused to fight for a general that was not from their state or to join with soldiers from a different state. In short, to unite as a confederacy undermines the very purpose of states had in seceding, and it will be an uphill battle for Davis to lead a nation of individual states. In conclusion, it seems that whatever the weakness is for one, it is the strength of the other side. So, what is the only thing the Union and Confederacy do have in common? Both sides will depend on their economies to help them win. For the industrial North, a transformation of products in their factories. For the planter South, selling that cotton to European merchants to fund their war. Spoiler alert, only one side's economy will be effective at this. It's the North. Each side had different goals in fighting the Civil War. Take a look at the blue box on the left-hand side of the screen. The North's goal was to restore the Union. Does that say end slavery? No, it does not. It says restore the Union. Its forces would have to invade the South and force the breakaway states to give up their quest for independence. And although slavery did drive a wedge between the two sides, President Lincoln's original purpose in the war is not to defeat slavery. The North was on offense, while the South was on defense. To achieve their goal as a legitimate independent country, separate from the United States, The Confederacy did not have to invade the North or destroy the Union Army. They weren't trying to change the North's way of life, but to simply defend their own. The South just needed to fight hard enough and long enough until the North got tired of fighting. I think this is my 6-year-old son's plan every day, to wear me down to the point I don't fight him on more snacks, more video games, or more YouTube videos. But unlike my son, the South's goal and its strategies are not going to work. So now that we know what their purposes in fighting were, let's see how each side plans on accomplishing this. The North's war plan came from General Winfield Scott, a hero of the war with Mexico. He knew that the North would have to defeat the South completely. To do this, Scott proposed a 3-part plan called the Anaconda Plan, which took its name from the kind of snake that squeezes its prey to death. First, the Union would blockade or close northern ports. This strategy would keep supplies from reaching the Confederacy and prevent the South from exporting its cotton to Europe. Second, the North would seek to gain control of the Mississippi River. This would split the Confederacy in two and cut the Southern supply lines. Ever heard the phrase divide and conquer? And the final step to the Union's plan was to capture Richmond, Virginia, the Confederate capital. Cutting off the head of the Confederacy leadership by taking over its capital is a war plan we've seen happen since the French and Indian War, when the British captured Quebec to destroy the will and ability of the French to fight. Scott and Lincoln both hoped this would produce the same results. And the Confederates' basic strategy was to conduct a defensive war. This meant that it would hold as much territory as possible. Southerners felt that if they showed determination to be independent, Northerners would tire of the war and leave the Confederacy in peace. The South also tried to win the support of Europe, particularly Great Britain, through their King Cotton theory. As the South supplied 75% of the world's cotton by 1860, the South expected European countries to either ally with the Confederacy or pressure the Union to end the war. However, as the Union's first step was to blockade Southern ports, the King Cotton strategy will not be as effective as hoped. In conclusion, as the war began, each side expected a quick victory. Northerners could not imagine the Confederates holding out for long against the Union's greater resources, and the Confederates believed the North could never subdue the fighting spirit of the South. Both sides would be devastatingly wrong, and the war lasted longer than most Americans could have guessed. Before we go, be sure to answer the matching vocabulary and the question regarding the quote at the bottom of your page 3 of your notes. Good luck on your quiz, and we'll see you next time for Lesson 2, Life at War.